Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome back to my ongoing review series of Halo the Master Chief Collection. On the chopping block today is Halo Reach, which was the last game that Bungie had a direct hand in. So without further ado, let's get started. Right off the bat, this is a game that many diehard fans aren't as fond of. Part of the reason is that it would have been difficult to follow up on Halo 3 given everything it does right, but there are a few problems it introduces. For most, these problems can be traced back to a single thing: the sprint button. On paper, it should have been a direct improvement, as it allows you a brief moment where you can cover more ground, run for cover, or have an easier time shaking someone's hand with an energy sword. And in the campaign, it does the job as intended, as it grants you a minor edge over the enemy you're up against, and therefore reduces the number of times where you're stuck repeating the same battle. In practice, that last point wasn't always the case, but what it did provide is a more natural feel to the energy sword, as now it's not just a matter of properly judging whether you're close enough to dash into your opponent, but instead a matter of timing your sprint to where you can reach them before they can take you out. When you transition to multiplayer though, it completely changes how maps need to be designed. To put it into perspective, here's a map that dates back to Combat Evolved, and works best for 4v4 scenarios. It's a small arena where, unless you're indoors, you can't walk 10 feet without either finding someone to shoot at or getting shot at yourself, meaning you don't have to wait long after respawning to get back in there. With Reach, however, the existence of sprint means that maps have to be more spread out to account for the greater movement range, leading to a lot of larger maps that make precision weapons even deadlier than they already were. This also means that maps which would have otherwise been just fine in an 8v8 environment are now only playable in 4v4. To further highlight that discrepancy, the battle rifle has been swapped out for the DMR, a single round rifle that acts like a discount sniper rifle. Whereas before you had to manage the recoil from multiple shots being fired, now all you have to manage is that single shot, to a degree where it's much easier to headshot and kill people from all the way across the map. This also makes it more frustrating to die, as it can give the perception that there was no way to avoid getting killed, leading matches to feel unfair. Add onto that the fact that it only takes 2 headshots to break shields and a third to kill them, and it meant if I was ever playing with friends, that we only ever played Reach in Firefight. What's even more annoying is that sprint is, theoretically, an optional tool, as throughout the campaign you once again have special equipment you can pick up, such as a stealth device that now sends bad information to enemy radars, an armor lock that allows you to take no damage at the expense of taking no action, the bubble shield making a return, though only for specific modes, and a jetpack that works as you would expect. The only difference is that these special abilities must be swapped out for each other and can be used multiple times, though there is a cooldown to keep you from spamming them. However, the only time you're mandated to use the different abilities during the campaign involve one case with the jetpack, and given the ground you can cover with sprint, there's not much motivation to pick up the others, aside from one instance where you're dealing with a lot of suicide grunts and might want to bring armor lock along. And even then, I only used it in legendary mode. Sure, in multiplayer you may occasionally see someone use an ability other than sprint, but those people are in the minority because the maps were designed to account for it. That then means when they do show up, they're often more of a surprise and annoyance instead of an interesting variation on the core gameplay. Especially since it's not exactly fun to have a basic tool that has worked just fine up until now, even for cloaked enemies, to now suddenly not work the moment the enemy enters stealth. That being said, for a lot of people who are playing the Master Chief Collection for the first time, especially for someone like me who played them as they were released, Reach may be the first Halo game they've played. Or at least the second if they got a taste of Combat Evolved, which means for a lot of younger PC gamers especially, this is likely your first taste of Halo multiplayer. As a result, I'll admit that I have a soft spot for it, as it was the environment that I first entered, the one I've spent most of my time with, and the one I'm probably still the best at.
Killjoy.
Well, relatively speaking anyway. And honestly, even with the issues that Sprint introduces, it does get a lot right. Though it's using the same engine as Halo 3 and ODST, the weapons are radically different, in part because the game is set as a prequel to the trilogy, but also to help it stand on its own and to accommodate the more spread out maps. The carbine and beam rifle have been replaced with the needle rifle and focus rifle. The former can now be held down to fire at the expense of losing some accuracy over time, while the latter requires you to hold down the beam and keep it on your opponent, which makes it a high-risk, high-reward weapon that's deadly if you can keep the enemy lined up, but also makes it a lot easier to spot you while you're using it. In fact, the lowered accuracy from sustained fire that you see with the needle rifle is a pattern that you see with a lot of weapons, as it's part of an even more controversial update called Bloom. With most weapons in the previous games, where you see the crosshair is where your shot will land. There were occasional cases where attempting to rapid fire a weapon would cause a bit of spread, such as with the Magnum in Combat Evolved, but here that spread applies to pretty much everything, even the precision weapons. That then means if you wish to be accurate, you can't just fire as fast as you can pull the trigger anymore, and your lack of accuracy is something built into the game instead of a result of recoil. That last part especially is what I find to be a problem, because it's one thing for a gun's accuracy to be knocked off by recoil, as that's a natural part of the weapon that we can learn to deal with. However, having a bit of inaccuracy with everything means you have to choose between firing more or firing with greater accuracy, no matter the weapon you're using or how good you are at adjusting for recoil. And honestly, I'm not sure what to think of this. On one hand, it technically forces you to be more deliberate with your shots, as I found out when playing one of the competitive modes we'll talk about later. With how spread out the maps are, perhaps they felt it best to include because otherwise, it would be a lot easier to take someone out from halfway across the map, even more so than it already is. And yet, it also increases the amount of randomness in the game, to where I find myself baffled when a shot I didn't expect to hit ends up being a headshot, or when I suddenly go down despite having full health, against what is from my perspective a body shot. Perhaps it was a change made to ensure a slightly more even playing field, to where even a total idiot like me can top the scoreboard, but is that necessarily fair to the dedicated gamer who worked hard to put themselves a leg up compared to their opponents? The casuals may outnumber the core audience, and it therefore makes sense to pander to them a little bit, but the hardcore crowd is the group that will sing your praises from here to the ends of the earth, buy everything you put out, and lead others to support you as long as you give them enough of what made the original work so compelling. And what really upsets that hardcore crowd is when you realize that all of these changes were made just to accommodate Sprint. First you have to create the larger arenas, then you have to make sure precision weapons aren't that deadly, so now you've made it to where you basically have to use Bloom, and end up throwing enough randomness into your shots that the dedicated audience isn't going to be as interested, as a result of a lowered skill ceiling. To get back on topic, dual wielding has also been taken away, but given the spread out battlefields, there aren't as many places where it could be useful. Some other weapons, such as the SMG, the Brute Shot, and the 2 new grenades also don't make an appearance, but in their place you have the Assault Rifle, which is back to being the weapon of last resort, and a dedicated grenade launcher with a bouncing projectile, making it a faster version of the frag grenade, which is harder to aim but a lot harder to respond to. The Magnum has also been changed again, to where it behaves more like the silenced pistol in ODST, but with a massive spread if you try and rapid fire it. Both the new grenade launcher and the Magnum work really well in their respective niches, with the former being a satisfying weapon to use properly, and the latter working well as a backup to the DMR. As for the vehicles, the Rocket Hog has made a return, though it now fires a volley of rockets after one button press instead of allowing you to fire them in a staggered manner. They're fairly slow moving, with each individual rocket not dealing a lot of damage, but their large explosion radius makes them hard to ignore. Typically you won't see them used over the Gauss Hog, but they will appear in some of the multiplayer maps and campaign missions, where they can sometimes be useful. Next up, they've added an intermediate vehicle between the Ghost and the Wraith called a Revenant. It's fairly maneuverable and has a weapon similar to the Wraith's main cannon, but apart from a passenger seat, there's no other armaments on it, and it's somewhat easy to shoot out the driver. It's a case where Bungie properly accounted for the size of the maps, giving an intermediate vehicle that could serve a similar role to the Wraith without being as insurmountable for infantry to take on. Finally, the Hornet has been swapped out for a gunship called the Falcon, which controls fairly differently and trades the forward-facing weapons for 2 machine guns on the side of the craft, which other players have to use. For the most part, I didn't find them to be all that useful in multiplayer, as while a Banshee can be fast enough for a Spartan laser to not fully connect, the same cannot be said for this vehicle. And especially considering the target lock rocket launchers got back in Halo 2, people do occasionally try to use them in multiplayer, but they're almost always shot down within a few seconds. They can be interesting to pilot in the campaign, as there's a section where you fly around with one that has a forward-facing gun, but that's about the only point where it's ideal to use them, mostly because they structured the level around it. Speaking of the campaign, this one places you as the newest member of a team of Spartans, which means for gameplay purposes, they act as unkillable allies when you're with them. They can't take on the entire mission by themselves, but it makes the game a solid entry point for newcomers if they want to play it safer, especially on Legendary mode. In fact, this game's Legendary mode was the first one I completed, as even with some of the crap it throws at you, the greater weapon variety and the fact that you're usually not alone means that it's easier to take cover for a little bit, let your allies take some of the heat, and then exploit the distraction to finish them off. That being said, there were still plenty of moments where I had to repeat a section over and over, and for some reason, not even landing a sticky grenade or energy sword will one-shot some elites now, which was all sorts of frustrating when I think, okay, they're down. only for them to either keep shooting when my back was turned or punch me in the face. Still, the fact that you don't have to be a one-man army all the time does make it easier. And after getting acclimated, I was able to figure out how best to limit what was being thrown at me. It's never a good feeling when an enemy one-shots you with a fuel rod cannon when you least expect it, but at least that BS is kept to a minimum compared to a certain other game. Besides that, the level design is once again really well done, with each encounter being well timed to keep you on edge, and with plenty of variety in how you approach them and what kind of threats you're up against. There's also a decent number of quality of life improvements, as the camera snaps to the enemy that kills you a lot more quickly, and I really like the change to the radar. Now instead of just putting a dot onto the map based on their location in a plane, now it'll tell you if they're above or below you, which is a very welcome addition considering the verticality that a lot of the maps employ. As for the game modes, there are a few new additions which are a mixed bag overall. One of the new game modes is called Headhunter, where instead of scoring points by killing enemies, everyone will drop a skull whenever they're killed, which can then be collected and delivered to a common point in order to score. It's an interesting spin on the Slayer mode, but it's not something that I found to be that enjoyable, as it requires you to play antithetically to what the game normally expects. With pretty much every other game mode, the idea is to cautiously move forward, watch your flank, and engage from a position where you can either duck for cover or effectively throw a grenade if you need to make a quick exit. However, Headhunter encourages you to make a mad dash toward whoever you just killed, which defeats the purpose of this. And due to the way respawns work, failing to do that means your enemy is likely to pick up and deliver the skull you just created by shooting his friend. Thanks to that, it's not a mode that I particularly enjoyed, though whether that's because I sucked at it is a decision I will leave to you, especially considering most of my footage in this mode was toward the start of my time with the Master Chief Collection. Next on the chopping block is a novel section that was added to the single-player campaign, where you take control of a starfighter and do some basic dogfighting. It's something that I wish had been fleshed out or given a multiplayer mode, but for the short time it's present, it's a nice change of pace from the running and gunning. As for other PvE content, the firefight mode returns, and thanks to the greater enemy variety and reach, it's something that I generally spent more time with. And not only did they add greater enemy variety, they added a new objective where, instead of ensuring you and your allies stay alive, you're instead defending a series of generators. If all of them fall, the game is over, though you have an unlimited number of lives if you need to suicide rush a group of Covenant, which is useful if you want to put up the temporary invincibility on one of the generators. It's something that made matchmaking for the mode more interesting, as then you didn't know if it would be a standard firefight where you stand your ground, or whether your focus would be on defending something else. And finally, you have a novel competitive mode called Invasion. This is the closest that the game comes to my comfort zone, as instead of just a 4v4 where you're either focused on taking each other out or doing one of the objective-based game modes, it's a 6v6 battle between Spartans and Elites, in which your goal is to either capture or defend a series of objectives. Each map starts out with 2 capture points, upon which if one of them is captured, it moves to 2 new points, and if one of those are captured, it becomes a game of one flag CTF. Each of these objectives have a very different feel to attack and defend, not just based on the differences in the map, but also because as you progress, both sides slowly get access to more weapons. The Spartans will start out with the assault rifle, Magnum, and Sprint, while Elites will get either a needler and cloaking device, or a plasma pistol, a somersault ability that acts like a dash, and a plasma repeater, which is basically the big brother of the plasma rifle. Right off the bat, the focus on precision weapons has been de-emphasized, leading to a lot more creative strategies than just going for the head, as it becomes a matter of sneaking up on the enemy with a cloaking device, grabbing the stray needle rifles and DMRs you can find, being careful with your Magnum shots, or abandoning all subtlety with one of the rifles. In the next phase, things get more interesting, as the objectives are usually slightly easier to defend, but now both sides get new loadouts. The Spartans keep their assault rifle and Magnum, but swap the Sprint out for either armor lock or a hologram, which puts out an identical copy of them to throw an enemy off. However, they also get a loadout that gives them their DMR alongside Sprint, making them immediately more effective from a longer range. As for the Elites, they can choose to either keep the dodge or the plasma repeater, with the former getting a needle rifle and the latter getting a hologram. And if you want to keep the cloak and needle, you now get a plasma pistol as well, in case you want to hit enemies with a charged shot and then punch them in the face. With these loadouts, you get a drastic change in the tactics available alongside a clear escalation in force, even before you mention that there may now be a vehicle in play. And if those second points are breached, you end up with a much more drastic escalation, as now it's a singular objective that you're aiming for, and now both sides have things like bubble shields and jetpacks and grenade launchers and energy swords, basically all of the modern comforts you could hope for in order to get the jump on your opponent. Each of these plays so differently to each other and perfectly take advantage of Halo's weapon variety that it's honestly Reach at its best. It's just a shame the other games don't have similar modes, or my recorded playtime would be even more ridiculous than it already is. So on the whole, when thinking back on the game, Halo Reach is a really mixed bag, as it does its best to adjust for the fact that sprint is now a thing, but in doing so, it ends up making a significant amount of the game worse for wear. While it works just fine for single player, all of the adjustments it makes to multiplayer can lead it to be rather frustrating for veterans and newcomers alike. And yet, I'll admit that I have a soft spot for it. For better or worse, it was my first taste of Halo multiplayer, and despite not liking some of the maps, I do still like a lot of the core mechanics, I appreciate a lot of the quality of life improvements, the campaign was really well set up, and Invasion was some of the most fun I've had with this series. Perhaps I'm in the minority on this, but as your first Halo multiplayer experience, it isn't a bad one. And with that said, that is where we shall end it for today. Up next will be the final game in the collection, and the first one that 343 had full creative control over. So here's hoping their first solo outing ends up being a good one. For now though, thank you all for watching, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time.